A peaceful protest outside the White House is dispersed forcibly. Tear gas, rubber-coated steel bullets and stun grenades are used to force the demonstrators further away. A few minutes later, the reason becomes clear. In a display of pure political theater, the president and former reality star walks out of the White House, across Pennsylvania Avenue, and through Lafayette Park, which had been surrounded by protesters during the day. He arrives at the St. John's Episcopal Church, which had been damaged in overnight unrest. Holding a Bible, the president tells reporters, "We have a great country." He did not enter the church to inspect the internal damage, but instead beckoned to some of those who'd walked with him to join him in front of the cameras. "I imposed a curfew at 7 p.m., tweeted the district's mayor. A full 25 minutes before the curfew and without provocation, federal police used munitions on peaceful protesters outside the White House, an act that will make the job of the D.C. Police Department officers more difficult, shameful. The timing and sequence of events points to one possible interpretation, that a peaceful protest was disrupted to allow the President of the United States a photo opportunity. A short while earlier, the President spoke in the Rose Garden, even as in an extraordinary moment, the protesters outside were being dispersed, and he essentially threatened to invoke martial law.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
This is entering controversial territory. In terms of the Insurrection Act, the president can deploy troops domestically, but only in a support role and only at the request of state governors or legislatures.
He really does not have the right to implement it in all 50 states, which is what he was saying. I mean, not all 50 states have anything going on, and the governor still would have a say-so with it.
The District of Columbia has no governor, and the president is legally allowed to unilaterally deploy military forces in the area, which he has already done. In unprecedented scenes, military police are deployed alongside law enforcement officers in the capital of the United States. As a 7 p.m. curfew passed and evening fell, the crackdown on protests continued. Lines of police advancing ominously on those defying the curfew. Then the arrest began, apparently in accordance with the instructions from the White House. A few remaining protesters walking past the Lincoln Memorial, a reminder of a better and possibly kinder time. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
So I want to go back to this Insurrection Act, which Mike referred to in his report. Just a few points on it. It was last invoked back in 1992 during the riots in Los Angeles after the beating of Rodney King. The Congressional Research Service reported in 2006 that a president must first issue a proclamation. He must order, quote, insurgents to disperse, and if that doesn't work, he or she may issue an executive order to deploy troops. The act also says the president doesn't actually need a state's permission to send in the military to, quote, enforce law or suppress rebellion. Let's talk to Harry Littman about it, former United States Deputy Assistant Attorney General, now the host of the Talking Feds podcast. He's on Skype from La Jolla, California. Thank you for your time, sir. So the president may not need the state's permission, but it would be quite a thing for the federal government and the military to move in like that into individual states.
It would be quite a thing. There's a general cultural sense that it really shouldn't be done except in the most extreme of circumstances. But as you say, Kamal, it's not true that he has to get permission. If he wants and he determines in his discretion that the law can't be enforced in a particular place because of the unrest or demonstrations, he can, on his own, call in the army.
And when I mentioned as well that there would be an executive order to deploy troops. Now, President Trump uses executive orders a lot for a lot of different things, and they don't necessarily happen. In this case, would this be one of those where he can just say, no, this is happening, and they have to do it?
Well, he certainly can, and my sense is that he will. I mean, it's true there are these formal requirements, but they're pretty straightforward. He can dot his I's and cross his T's fairly easily. And I think he wants to show who's boss, especially in certain jurisdictions where he thinks the local authorities aren't being strong enough. And as I say, it only takes him acting on his own to do it.
Be interesting, that idea you just posed of states not doing enough and current law enforcement not doing enough, because everything we're seeing right now is actually of police using excessive force, ironically in protests about police brutality. There is almost a sort of quasi-militarization of the police anyway. They have the rubber bullets, they have the tear gas. I mean, look at the pictures.
I mean, it's really true. And you imagine adding to those pictures military rolling in tanks, and it's kind of a terrifying tableau. And it's the reason why it's very, very rarely invoked, the Insurrection Act. There's just a strong cultural prohibition against it. There's a special law, in fact, that says it's a crime to do it unless Congress has authorized it. But that's, of course, where the Insurrection Act comes in here. Congress passed that statute after the Civil War, and it, by its terms, would authorize it. But the overall sort of political and cultural cost, I think, would be extreme. The sense of military rolling in the streets to quell citizens' demonstrations is anathema to most Americans.
I mentioned the last time this was invoked was 1992, the LA riots. Can you tell our viewers, because it's a while ago now, and not everyone will be familiar with what happened then, what did it look like then, the military on the street, and how did it play out?
Yes, that was actually the Rodney King case I actually worked on. And what happened was, after another very controversial police beating case, there was a trial, and the trial ended in the acquittal of the officers. And rioting quickly broke out, some of it very savage. And then President George W.B. Bush, the older Bush, he asked the Los Angeles authorities, and they welcomed him. They said, yes, please come in. We need you. But again, just as you were saying up front, Kamal, to play this sort of supplementary role, not to be facing off against protesters, but to be applying sort of logistical help, a little bit of extra muscle and strategy, not to really have tanks confronting demonstrators in the streets.
Harry, this has been really interesting talking to you, really informative. Thank you. Harry Lippman joining us from La Jolla in California.
Thanks. Come on.